What I'm going to be talking about today basically is the the Indian mounds that were once around Rock Lake. We're not going to be talking about pyramids or any pseudoscience or anything like that. We're going to be actually talking about the actual Native American burial sites that were around Rock Lake and what was there at one time, what remains, and what we actually know about those mound sites. And what we're first going to do, though, is just kind of go through a little bit of what mounds are, what they're not, a little bit of the ideology behind mounds. And of course, mounds are ancient burials. They're also ceremonial sites. There's at least a 2,000 plus year history of mound construction in the state of Wisconsin, beginning back somewhere between about 800 to 500 BC and continued all the way up until about 900 years ago, give or take. And of course, mounds are constructed of basket loads of dirt. These are burial sites. There's a lot of misinformation out there about what mounds are and what they aren't. They are burials. They are burials. So if there's anything that you need to take away from this lecture today, that's it. Most of the effigy mounds, which we'll be talking about today, are located in Wisconsin, the southern third of Wisconsin, very little bit in northern Illinois, a little bit in northeastern Iowa, and a little bit in southwestern Minnesota. And if you've ever been over to northeastern Iowa, I'm sure many of you have probably gone to Effigy Mounds National Monument. They got the national park. We didn't. We should have gotten the national park, but they're doing a good job over there preserving the mounds that they have in their neck of the woods and helping to propagate the mission. And effigy mound builders are often commonly thought of as small nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples that were highly mobile, making subsistence rounds around areas. And these are just some images that are actually from the museum at Effigy Mounds National Monument. And as a graduate student, I was fortunate enough to work there for about 6 months as an intern to go through their museum collections that they have in the basement of the visitor center down there and to do a write-up about that. A lot of the information that you're going to see in this presentation comes from Dr. Amy Rosebrough's dissertation. If you don't know Amy Rosebrough, she is technically the Assistant State Archaeologist of Wisconsin with the Wisconsin Historical Society. And her PhD dissertation, which she finally completed back in 2010, is this right here. And what this is, it's a 2,500 page manuscript that is a massive, massive database of information. It has every single known effigy mound site in it, every single map, every single detail of prior and previous excavations, and a lot of the things that happened over on Rock Lake 100 years ago with a lot of the earlier settlers that were in this area were documented in this dissertation. And then also another person we'll talk about today is Charles Brown. Charles E. Brown, not the Charlie Brown of Snoopy, but Charles E. And if you ever talk to any of the old-time archaeologists, if you say Charles Brown, they will correct you. They will say it's Charles E. Brown. So don't make that mistake. He was a founding father of the State Historical Society. He was the state's first archaeologist. He was the founding father of Wisconsin Archaeological Society. This guy did a lot of stuff. And most of the mound sites that you see around Madison today and the city parks, which there are dozens, he's directly responsible for a lot of the preservation of those mounds in conjunction, and this is an interesting history that I always like to bring out, most of the mound sites were preserved by women's clubs back around the turn of the last century, the Wisconsin Federation of Women's Clubs, because most of the women that were in these clubs were the wives of the archaeologists at the time. So they gathered their resources at the time, working with people like Charles Brown, and they raised significant sums of money to preserve mound sites around the state, especially the famous Man Mound of Baraboo, who some of you are familiar with, that recently just became our nation's last National Historic Preservation, or historic site or whatever. So we had a ceremony there last year for that. Some other information, if you're not familiar with these two books by Bob Birmingham, is Bob here? I don't see, he's over across the street. But Bob has written a couple of really good general overview books of Wisconsin mound culture with the second edition of Indian Mounds of Wisconsin, which just came out this past year. And then the other book that came out just a few years ago is Spirits of Earth. Spirits of Earth is a book that focuses on the mounds around Madison and uses them as a case study to explore meaning, or what we think we know about the meaning behind mounds. And this comes from the ethnographic record and a bunch of different types of sources. So if you haven't had those books in your if you're interested in more information, those are 2 books that you can buy down in the Friends of Aztalan trailer today, actually. They're about 12 bucks a piece, I believe. So I mentioned this before, there are about 3,200 effigy mounds still remain, roughly 9,700 conical. Conical mounds are the round-shaped dome mounds, not effigy mound shape. Effigy, of course, means in the shape of something, like all of these on here, except for the round ones, are effigies. And we'll talk about what that means. And they're primarily built between 500 BC and 1250 AD. And there may have been as many as 25,000 to 30,000 mounds, maybe even as many as 40,000 mounds at one time. We'll never know, because a lot of them were destroyed before they were ever documented in farm fields and things like that. And Increase Lapham, who many of you have heard of, when he came to Wisconsin as a surveyor in 1836 in Milwaukee, he literally came here working for Byron Kilbourne and started surveying the streets of Milwaukee. And when he was doing that, he saw mounds that were being destroyed in front of his face. And he got concerned about it. And many of you are familiar with the Antiquities of Wisconsin as surveyed and described. And that's a book that he produced in 1855, where he went to an organization called the American Antiquarian Society. And today we know that organization as the Smithsonian Institution. And he went to them and he said, if you give me $500, I will go around and I will produce this work by mapping as many mound sites in southern Wisconsin as I can. And he did this for the course of a couple years. In July of 1850, right around this time, he was at Aztalan. And Aztalan was actually first discovered in 1836 by Timothy Johnson. But he was here and he noted what he saw at that time, and at that time, even in 1850, the fields had been plowed for nearly 15 years, actually obscuring a lot of the features that you see that are over at the site today that have been reconstructed. But anyway, he produced this work, and that was the first work on mounds. And many of the mound sites that are in that book today no longer exist. But it's an absolutely essential piece of literature, because it gives us an idea of what was once there. And so just a little bit about mound type progression. Early woodland mound sites being built between about 500 BC to 200 BC. The Native Americans at the time, they start off by building large round dome conical mounds. And they vary in size from about 30 to 50, 60 feet in some cases. Sometimes they're only a couple feet high, sometimes they're as high as 6 to 9 feet high. And then a short time after that, we don't know exactly when, they started to incorporate shorter cigar-shaped linear mounds, linear embankment mounds. And that went on for a number of years. And then there's this whole other culture that we're not even going to touch today called the Middle Woodland Hopewell culture of Ohio. That's a mound building culture that built mounds in the Ohio River Valley of the gigantic geometric earthwork. Some of you might be familiar with some of those if you go to Hopewell National Monument or the Great Serpent Mound over by about 70 miles east of Cincinnati. And a lot of this Hopewell geometric ceremonialism of large geometric embankment sites, that didn't really spill over into Wisconsin too much. We have in southeastern Wisconsin, we have in archaeological terms what we call the Waukesha focus of this culture, where they were building some of their larger conical mounds. If any of you are from Waukesha, the city of Waukesha, and you go to the public library right on the Fox River, there are 2 or 3 really big, large conical mounds that are on the front lawn of the Waukesha Public Library that are preserved there. Those are the very first mounds that were actually preserved in the state of Wisconsin with the express purpose of preserving them for preservation. And they happen to be Hopewell conical burial mounds. And then in the late woodland, somewhere right around, well, the late woodland period as we know it in archaeological terms starts around 400 AD. But the mound building of the effigy mound construction doesn't start until sometime, this is debated a little bit. Amy Roseborough will tell you, she kind of pushes the dates up a little bit to like closer to 650 to 700. I happen to believe they were doing it a little bit earlier than that, somewhere right around 500 AD or so. And they continued to make effigy mounds from about 500 AD to about 1200 AD. And what was going on at Aztalan here right around 1100 AD when they established Aztalan as a Mississippian site directly affected the indigenous late woodland mound builders. Aztalan is an entirely intrusive, non-indigenous culture that came up into Wisconsin and totally radically transformed the landscape here at that time. But that's another lecture. We're focusing on Rock Lake. So again, just starting mound construction in the late woodland, somewhere right around in this area here. 600 AD to about 1100, 1200 AD. So it's a significant amount of time, 500-600 years of mound construction. Oh, I went backwards. But what we're going to focus on is just this late woodland period. And the late woodland, or the woodland period as a whole, throughout the early, middle, and late, is encompassed by the tradition and defined by these traits. It's the first time that we see pottery in the archaeological record, right around 500 BC. So they're constructing burial mounds, right? And they're making pottery. So what does that tell us? That tells us that people are changing. They're becoming more sedentary on the landscape. They're becoming a little bit more territorial. There's ritualism that's starting to develop with the construction of mounds. And there's also a little bit of plant cultivation at beginning at this time. But this didn't develop uniformly throughout the state. Northern parts of the state kind of started in the south and gradually made its way into the north. But the basic archaic life way of hunter-gatherers is still in place. They're still moving around and still subsisting in areas where there's a high yield for subsistence. Common names or common mound forms, just a few of the most common basic ones that we see. And the incidence of these types of mounds in different areas around the state, sometimes some parts of the state have other types of mounds and other parts of the states have others. And I'll talk about that a little bit. And that has a little bit to do with some of the ideology that we're going to talk about. Now, I put a lot of stuff on the screens, and that's just for your benefit. I just kind of talk, and you can read it, and if you don't want to read it, then that's fine. But Spirits of Earth, okay, Bob Birmingham's book. The underlying ceremonialism is a 2 or 3 part division of the universe. So most Native American cultures in the Great Lakes region, especially in the upper Great Lakes, they tend to segregate their belief system or their cosmology into a tiered system. So we have the upper world and the lower world. So you have the thunderbirds of the upper world, and you have the beings of this plane, mammals and humans. And then they also have an entirely different realm of the underworld where they have mythic beings like long-tailed panthers and things like this that patrol the Rock River and the various mound shapes we believe are representative of this tiered universe. And the linear mounds, there's been a lot of talk about what the linear mounds mean. Some of these mounds are not, the linear mounds are not just the shorter cigar-shaped ones. They're actually elongated. And some Native Americans have told us that, that these are meant to represent serpents or snakes as part of the underworld pantheon. And but if you read Birmingham, what he will tell you is that this demonstrates Effigy Mound's concern for the selection of specific terrain. So what they're doing is they're literally recreating their cosmology on the landscape in the form of burials. And there is a what's the word? There is a concern. There is a concern for the natural terrain, right? And how they are placing these mounds on the landscape. And there is a concern about balancing the upper and lower worlds. So oftentimes when you go on a mound site, especially mound sites that have multiple mounds on them, very rarely will you see just a mound site that just has like an upper world image of a mound, like a bird. Usually you'll have a bird and a bear, or a bird and a water spirit type mound. And it's this idea of harmonizing and balancing the upper and lower worlds. Now, one thing to think about it this way too, as we talk a little bit more about ideology, is that in our modern sense of how we think as Homo sapiens sapiens, we tend to think in a very linear fashion from A to B, from August to September, or whatever it is. But ancient people didn't really think like that. They had a much more cylindrical view of their universe. They were adapting to the changing seasons. So you have spring, summer, fall, and a circular or cylindrical type seasonal change. And a lot of the ideology behind a lot of the mounds symbolizes that. And I'll show you some examples of that. So again, just various, so we have sky, earth, and water, right? Upper world, lower world, various forms of animals. Now, some of this is subjective, obviously. I mean, you can surmise that this might be a goose mound, and these are certain types of bird forms, of course. And then this thing here, which is often called a mink in the literature, but is it a mink? Maybe. Then you have these other somewhat subjective forms of the lower pantheon. If you can imagine a cat laying on its side with its tail and its head. And then this one is meant to be a top-down view of the same mound, another type of effigy. Then you have the linear forms. And then we oftentimes, especially in southwestern Wisconsin, have these examples of these biconical chain mounds where they seem to have connected conical mounds with linear embankments between them. And we don't really know what that means. Is it an effigy, or is it meant to talk about that concept of maybe connecting generations through time? Something like that. And then we also have anthropomorphic forms, and the only one that remains in the state of Wisconsin, which I mentioned before, is what we call the Greenfield Man Mound, or the Baraboo Man Mound, because it's just outside of Baraboo here. If you haven't been to that site, I suggest you go over and you check out the Man Mound. He was just nominated and accepted over the last 10-year period as I said before, our nation's most recent National Historic Landmark. We actually had the director of the National Park Service there last summer, and they came and did a big ceremony. And so we have anthropomorphic forms and human form. These were noted around a very specific part of the state, in the central Baraboo Range and a little bit east of there. And then along the lower Wisconsin Riverway, this is one that's over by Muscoda, Wisconsin. And then we also have ones that are kind of like, almost like a combination between possibly fork-tailed birds like swallows or birdmen. Who knows? A lot of different ideas about that. What's that?
Where is the Man Mound in Baraboo? How would you get that?
It's right on Highway, if you take Highway 33 from off the freeway by Cascade there or whatever, and you just go straight out about maybe 5 miles, eventually it starts to turn to the left, and then you'll see Man Mound Road right there. You can't miss it. You turn on Man Mound Road, you go down a mile, and it's right there. So it's a county park now. And the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, we used to own that site actually. And then the women's clubs back in the day, they helped to raise the money to purchase the site from the landowners for preservation. And then eventually we turned it over to the county. So this is just an idea of giving you an idea of where some of these anthropomorphic forms are. You know, we're way down here in Rock Lake. We don't have any of these types of forms. Actually, I take that back. Believe it or not, I'm not going to talk about this in great depth, but right down this road, about a mile down the road, there was an anthropomorphic effigy mound at one time. And it was noted in Lapham's in his notes, Increased Lapham's notes when he was here. And believe it or not, it was in the form of a woman. It did not have a horned headdress. And the reason that they called it a woman, quite frankly, is because it had 2 conical mounds on its chest. I'm not kidding. And there's actually a sketch of this that I'll post it on the Effigy Mounds Initiative Facebook page later, and you can see the sketch of it. It looks like a woman, so it's the only one that I know of that's ever been documented like that. So a lot of this stuff about meaning, right? About ideology, about what we think we know about mounds, comes with the assumption and knowledge that mounds have multiple levels of meaning, right? So, and this comes from oral histories, archaeological excavations in particular, ethnographic record of many Native American groups around the Upper Great Lakes, and what are the most common beliefs about what we think about these mounds. So burial sites have single and multiple burials in them. Effigy mounds in general can typically contain a singular burial, not always, but typically. And usually those burials are located in what we would consider like the heart region of the mound. But not always. Sometimes they're in the wing, sometimes they're not. Of course, we talked about how these are sacred religious and ceremonial sites. And by building these mounds, it also implies a controlled sacred knowledge and possibly prestige acquirement within the tribe. So if you're a young man and you're trying to make a name for yourself, if you can organize a communal large earthwork project to build a mound site, it might have something to do with prestige acquirement. And most of these mound sites, with the mounds and the effigy mound shapes themselves, more than likely represent ancient clan symbolism. And the Ho-Chunk Nation will tell you that they are the ones who claim to be the more direct ancestors of the mound builders, okay? And if you look at their clan symbolism of Bear Clan, Deer Clan, Thunderbird Clan, Water Spirit Clan, there are 12 clans, most of the mound sites are represented by this type of idea. And also, I believe early on when they start building conical mounds in the early woodland, most of these conical mounds in the early woodland are located right on large bends in the river. So if you think about this in ancient times, people are using these river systems as their ancient highways. The Crawfish, the Rock, the Wisconsin, the Fox, Mississippi. And if there are any big, real distinct bends in rivers, usually you will see large conical mounds placed on the inner and sometimes the outer bends of those rivers. So if you're coming up that river in ancient times and you're getting to a landmark that you're looking at the landmark, just like Aztalan would have been a landmark on the Crawfish River. If you're coming up this river, you would have been stopped by the people at Aztalan. They're using these as territorial markers by saying, we were here, our ancestors are here, this is our territory type of thing, right? So mound sites were chosen also because of certain spiritual or supernatural attributes attributed to the natural landscape. Oftentimes, but not always, they will use the natural terrain to represent this upper and lower world. So for instance, in my neck of the woods in Dodge County, we have a lot of southwest trending glacial drumlin hills. And in Dodge County, we have 150 mound sites that are still preserved. And what they do, or what they seem to be doing on a lot of these mound sites, is in some cases, they're using the higher terrain to build the bird mounds on top of these higher terrains. And then if you go downslope from these terrains, you have the birds up high, maybe downslope a little bit, the birds of the middle world, and then on the lower slopes, closer to the water, you have the mounds that represent the lower world pantheons. So there's an idea of using this natural terrain to mimic what the ideology behind them is. So upper world, lower world connotations again. And in some cases, not very many, there seem to have been a few effigy mounds in the past that were excavated in the past that didn't contain anything in them at all. And what that tells us, if this is true, I think what generally tended to happen was, I think early excavators were overlooking cremation type burials in mounds. And they actually, when you read the field notes, they actually kind of describe a cremation burial, but they say, well, there's nothing here because there's nothing but ash, you know, or whatever. But if there are an absence of burials in mounds, what that tells us is that the actual ceremonial nature of the construction itself was just as important in the overall scheme of the belief system of putting people in there or not putting people in there. We're almost done with this ideology stuff. Then we're going to start clicking on Rock Lake, all right? So Wisconsin mound builders are semi-territorial entities with a shared ritual complex. Now, oftentimes I get questions by people, well, what Native American tribe built the mounds? Well, all of them did. At one time during prehistory and throughout prehistory, every single Native American tribe in North America at some point was involved with burial site ritualism. It was a Pan-American thing, and it happened on the eastern seaboard, it happened in down south, it happened in the Great Lakes area in different forms. But the ritualism and the shared ritual complex is Pan-American, and it happened over a great period of time. Oftentimes we talk about like social arrangements in archaeology or anthropology as well. Who are the people that are buried in the mounds? Well, from the excavations, a little bit of excavations that we actually did over a 170-year period, there was no real differentiation between male, female, children, older people. We see all of these different types of people buried in mounds. Now, the fact that effigy mounds generally contain singular burials might tell us something, that that person maybe was important and maybe was a shaman or something like that. And typically when you have a conical burial mound, which they also built during the late woodland period when they were building effigy mounds, they still continue to build conical mounds as well. Conical burial mounds tend to have multiple burials in them of people. So is that a shared status of those people possibly being a lower status in a conical mound? And if you're a bigwig, you're in an effigy? We don't really know, but it seems to possibly point that way. And the other big question we get a lot are our mounds aligned with astronomical or celestial alignments? And I can definitively tell you, yes, they are, with no doubt about it. And they are using some mounds, not all mounds, but some mounds, if you go onto certain mound sites, are positioned to point, if you will, towards the landscape. and they will show you the directional locations on the horizon of winter and summer solstices, things of that nature. Okay, and this ties into some of the ideology that we talk about of upper and lower world. And what these mounds really are, if you've noticed if any of you have been to a mound site, most of these mounds are pretty huge. And in some cases, when you walk around them, or you have to walk around them to be able to understand or see what they are. Okay? Well, that tells you something as well. And I can tell you for a fact that these mounds were meant to be seen from above. And like the Nazca lines type of thing. And I'm not talking ancient aliens. And this has nothing to do with ancient aliens, all right? This is a Native American belief system that had to do with upper and lower world connotations. And one of the things that there's a recent work that I'm working on with another mound researcher, a gentleman named Mark Olson, and we're going to be publishing a 400-page book in the next couple months. And basically what we did was we went back and we looked at every single thing that was ever written or done about mounds, every single map, every single research report, every single ethnographic record that's ever been talked about. And we started to examine this, and there were common themes that started to come out. And one of them was this idea of the path of souls. Have you ever heard that concept, the path of souls, and the Milky Way being the path of souls? Well, this is a common theme across the eastern seaboard and in the upper Great Lakes. Many Native Americans believe in this concept of the path of souls. And what it is in a nutshell is that when they die, they believe that they were taken up to the path of souls, which was the Milky Way. And then once you got there, your spirit went on a celestial journey through the path of souls and had to overcome certain obstacles. And what these mound sites are is the mounds themselves are actually vehicles of soul transmission from the lower world up to the upper world in clan symbolism form. Okay? That's one way to think about them. Just give you a second to read through that. Mounds seem to depict natural aspects of the animal behavioral traits, all that type of stuff. Metaphors for offspring. The Ho-Chunk deer clans, we talked about that a little bit. Turtle or goose effigy mounds that are not clan symbols. These may represent metaphors for migration and hibernation. One thing I can tell you, and I'll show you an example of this, is, so we're talking about a mound, right? Let's look at a bear mound in particular. If you have a bear mound on the ground, what do bears do? They hibernate, right? So oftentimes what we're finding by restudying some of these mounds and their positioning is we're finding that, in fact, a lot of bear mounds actually walk or look like they're walking along a winter solstice alignment. So what does a bear do? It's back to this cylindrical view of nature. A bear goes into the hibernation in the winter, comes out in the spring, and if it's a female, oftentimes has cubs. So it's this idea of regeneration, renewal, earth renewal type of thing. So effigy mounds are typically located near prominent bodies of water, including lakes, marsh, rivers, streams, all these important things. But most importantly, natural springs. And most Native Americans will tell you, if you talk to them, that springs are sacred. And they're viewed as literal doorways to the underworld where human and animals can go between the upper and lower world. So oftentimes when we have panther mounds like this, they're actually depicted either crawling out of a spring area or into a spring area. Oak savanna setting was a main environmental zone that they're usually constructed in. We talked about a lot of that stuff. Here's something that's really interesting. So we have the southern third of Wisconsin, right? Or southern half of Wisconsin. All of you have probably heard of the driftless area of Wisconsin, the unglaciated part of Wisconsin. 10,000 years ago, we had the last glacial period, the Wisconsin glaciation, and over the last 10 or 12,000 years, we've come out of that into what we call the Holocene, and this part of the state was unglaciated, right? So we have a lot of high or deep valleys and high ridged fields in southwestern Wisconsin. And in southern Wisconsin, we have glacial drumlin hills, but down in this area, we have a lot of lakes, rivers, streams, natural springs, all these types of things. And what they were doing based on the distribution of mound types, is in southwestern Wisconsin, in the higher bluff areas, they were primarily only bird and bear mounds. Whereas in southeastern Wisconsin, where we have a lot more water resources, a lot more lakes, a lot more springs, we have a high density of long-tailed panther type mounds or water lower pantheon top mounds. So there's this conscious effort to use the natural landscape to ram that point of ideology. I can tell you for a fact there is only one panther mound that exists in southwestern Wisconsin, just right near La Crosse. Otherwise, they're all in this region down here. That tells you something. Okay, is everybody with me so far? We're getting the rock like I promised, but you got to understand what we're talking about, otherwise it doesn't do you any good, right? If you don't have a lot of background in mounds. So effigy mound burials typically contain 3 or 4 different types of burials. Effigy mounds never contain extended burials, in the flesh extended burials. That is more a product of early woodland mound construction, and for some reason, we don't know why, they got away from extended burials in the late woodland. And then they started mostly constructing bundle burials and in the flesh flex burials, or in the fetal position flex burials. Now bundle burials are interesting because the bundle burials have been in the archaeological record for many thousands of years of Wisconsin. And it seems to hint at ancestor worship. So like also when you have the main part of mound construction in the warmer months, right? You can't dig in the wintertime. So what happens if you die in the wintertime? What are we going to do with you? Well, we put you up on a tree, or we put you in a scaffolding, and then all your flesh decays, and then after that we go back and we bundle you up. And that's what these bundle burials are. And they would take these from sites that people may have died, and then in the warmer months when people would congregate into larger hunter-gatherer bands at a designated mound site, they would bring these people with them that died in bundles and then perform the burial ritualism of burying the people in the mounds. Now, when you see these larger mound sites with multiple mounds, these mound sites were not all built at one sitting. These people were going back to these mound sites for many, many years over successive generations and adding mounds to them in most cases. So we have a lot of these type of burials in there. And as I mentioned before, if you are in an effigy, typically you're buried in what we would call the heart region of the mound, but not always. Sometimes there are burials in wings of birds and things, and I'm sure that all means something too, and we could talk about that for hours, about the meaning behind stuff like that. Cremation burials were also quite common in effigy mounds. This is actually work by Dr. Roseborough, where she just did a color painting, watercolor painting of burial of a mound. This is an example of a long-tailed panther mound, or some people call them turtle mounds, and the burial features in a mound. I'm going to skip over Havlar Scavulum. This guy, because I know some of you want to get to the other lecture, and this is going to go on. Havlar Scavulum was a guy who he was considered the John Burroughs of Wisconsin, kind of like a John Muir kind of guy. And he lived in this area at one time, and he was one of the first guys that mapped a lot of the mound sites over on Rock Lake with Charles E. Brown, the guy we talked. And Scavulum was a naturalist, and well, I'll just go through it. If you guys want to sit and listen, I'll go through it. But I don't want to keep anybody if you got to go. But because I tend to be a wordy bastard. So he wrote, this guy was, what this guy did, which was really interesting, was he was one of the first guys that figured out how Native Americans did flint knapping and how they actually produced stone tools. He studied it, and he started to practice it, and he figured out the techniques of flint knapping, which is really interesting. And if you go to the Hoard Museum in Fort Atkinson, they have a lot of his artifacts and things there that he produced and things that he picked up around here. And he was also an early frequent contributor to the Wisconsin Archaeologist Journal. I want to mention this about the Wisconsin Archaeologist Journal. We have a journal in our state that's called the Wisconsin Archaeologist. It is the oldest continuously published scientific journal in the country. So if you know anything about Wisconsin, that's one of our claims to fame, right? This just talks about some of the things that Scavulum did. He helped promote and found the State Library Association, Historical Society, Archaeological Society. He did a huge bug and bird exhibit at the World's Fair back in the 1800s in Chicago, 1893. So he did a bunch of things. This is him in a field right near here, picking up some Native American artifacts. Foot Napping Digest. I never knew there was such a thing until I started to read about this guy. That's him on Lake Kashkanag. Now, Charles Brown, we talked about him. I won't go into any great detail about him, but he also mapped mound sites on Rock Lake that I'll show you. And interesting thing about Charles E. Brown is if you go to the Forest Home Cemetery in Madison, that's his grave marker. Archaeologist. Makes it pretty easy to find. I'm seriously thinking about doing that when I die. Something like Mound Man, something. This is Charles Brown on the left there, excavating a mound on UW's campus. There he is.
Is that Lakeshore?
So, what?
Where was that last mound? That looks like one in Madison.
It is. It's on the picnic. It's one of the picnic point mounds.
Every day.
Yeah.
On my bike.
Yep. So, Wisconsin Archaeologist, 1926 is the first mention in the in the literature, if you will, or scientific literature about mounds on Rock Lake. Charles Brown comes here, 1928. This is him down here on Rock Lake in 1926, I mean. And he starts to go around the lake, and of course, Rock Lake was very different back then. None of the development on it, none of the stuff that we have today. So this is from Roseborough's dissertation. She shows the concentration of mounds around Rock Lake right here. There are many mound sites were on Ripley Lake. There are 27 mound sites that still exist on Lake Kashkanag, and many outliers on the Crawfish and Upper Rock or Lower Rock River Basin here. So a lot of mound sites in Jefferson County. Many of them still exist. And of course, the Winnebago in 1830s called Rock, as you know, after the beer here. Tyrania, right? Which means sparkling waters. Then there's also this Oliver Lemire guy. He was a Winnebago informant of a lot of ethnographers back in the day. And he always thought that Rock Lake really meant Muddy Lake, which I think was more appropriate because we can't find those pyramids because it's so muddy, right? We can't find them because it's too muddy out there. And then he also indicated that there was an Indian village on Rock Lake at one time that was called Kashkanag, which we named Lake Kashkanag with a K south of here. I'll skip over that. So most of the mound sites on Rock Lake, save for one that we know of, exists below the mill pond here on the eastern shore from here down through the trailer park, which is down in this area off of A down here. So through this stretch of land right through here. Then the railroad tracks come across here. That's where they concentrated their mound building efforts for some reason. More than likely because you have a nice area, especially in the Sandy Beach area there, where it's pretty flat, and then you go in a ways, and then it kind of goes upslope a little bit. So there's a nice area for mound construction in these three sections. One mound site called the Crossing Mounds Group in section 15 that I'll show you. This is just Lake Mills from an 1879 sketch. Shows Lake Street, Main Street going this way. Now, the opposite side of the lake back in these days was often written about as being massive stands of tamarack forest, okay? And if you know anything about Aztalan and the palisade wall over here that they built back in the day, a lot of the logs that were used to build the palisade at Aztalan were tamarack. So it's possible that they were maybe even coming as far over a mile or two from Aztalan over to the lake, bringing logs back over here. But I suspect what's going on is that there were also at one time tamarack stands even around this immediate area, and they were floating the logs up and down the Rock River as well. Now, on Main Street here in Lake Mills in 1880, there was a well-known turtle effigy mound, which was really a panther mound. Sometimes these top-down mounds that look like this, some in the early literature they used to refer to those as turtles. They're not really turtles. They're panthers or underworld type mounds. And there was one right on Main Street, and this was probably what they said was probably located on the Smith Place just south of the mill. And this is actually a picture of Main Street in Lake Mills at that time. What's that?
Am I looking at it strange? Is that where the park is?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it may still be there.
Yep.
Is there?
It's always really interesting to see these old photos. Now this is a map that Charles Brown used to take, Charles E. Brown used to take plat books, and he would put these little black circular humps on there, mounds, conical mounds, on the maps here where he would find mound sites. So this is just him showing where the mound groups were. One of them is called Phillips Ferry Mound Group, Sandy Beach, Everson Woods Mounds and the Village Site, and then over on the South Shore Mound Group, which is called the Crossing Mounds. They also, there's a guy named Frank Mansfield around 1907 that also claimed that there were mounds up here by Tyrrhenia Park up here, and there is a mound in that park actually that's there. I'll show you. This is just that blown up a little bit. So you see all the double circles here all the way down through the lower marsh area. Now, why did they build mounds on Rock Lake like this and inhabit this area? Because of natural resources. They needed clean water, they needed the springs, and most of all, at one time, Rock Lake, when it was really shallow before it was inundated by the dam and stuff, was like Koshkonong, was a massive stand of wild rice that they would harvest for subsistence. Now, just like you and I, if we were all thrust back in the Paleolithic right now, I would give maybe 2/3 of you would die in the first 72 hours. Some of us heavier dudes, we'd last a little longer maybe. Maybe not, I don't know. But if you got to fend for yourself, you're going to go where the highest yield is, right? And that's what they're doing. So mound breakdown, conical over linear effigy. Only 8 effigy mounds documented in this area, which is a kind of a low number. 4 of the 8 total effigy mounds are water panther or water spirit types. One of them that Scavlem designated on his map as a lynx. It's not a lynx. It's a typical bear mound. But you know, a lynx has a short tail like a bear, so they were people would sit there and say, "Well, is this a lynx or is this a bear?" I don't know. Maybe it was a lynx. I don't know. And linear mounds, which are the predominant type, and especially tapering linears, and I'll show you what that means. We're kind of the high density of mounds in this area. And this shows just the counties around southeastern Wisconsin and the distribution and concentration of panther effigy mounds in this area. And if you go over by the 4 lakes of Madison, high density of effigy mounds. And in my neck of the woods on the Horicon Marsh, one of the largest freshwater marshes in the world, lots of panther mounds, right?
Yep.
We go there and dig them. Well, we don't dig them, we clean them up. Now, when you're looking at mound sites on the landscape like this in map form, they do have a general arrangement type of clustering or patterning. We call clustered, kind of jumbled up, linears in long rows. This is very common in southwestern Wisconsin along the tops of those bluffs and things. But in this area, most of the mound sites around Rock Lake were kind of in this semi-linear fashion. And you'll see once you look at the maps here. Phillips Ferry. T.H. Lewis was a mound mapper who came here. He was like Lapham and did a lot of mapping in the 1880s and 90s. So this is the first sketch done by Halvar and a guy named Alonzo Pan in 1912, just north of Sandy Beach. You see all these linear mounds right here. I got better examples of this. That's the entirety of the mound group that stretches down the lake from August 1912. So you got some linear mounds up here, double linears, conicals, water panther, bear, kind of clustered in that area. And these guys measured these, took measurements. They didn't dig them, but they took measurements and noted features about the mounds themselves. This is just a blow up of that lower half of that map. And you can see it says Panther Effigy Mound, 120 feet long.
Mr. Sampson, could you go back to that picture with the map and show us like where Sandy Beach today is?
No. Yeah, I can do that as long as you're willing to sit here. It's just going to make it longer. This one?
On it. Yeah, like where I see the south end of the lake, but I don't know like where's what. Like where would be Sandy Beach?
Well, I'll give you that.
Okay, sorry.
They're by your house.
Okay, that's what I was wondering.
But when I talked to you yesterday, I talked to her yesterday. I saw her in her driveway and I pulled up and I rolled down my window and I said, "Hey, come here." And she's looking at me like, "Who's this guy?" I said, "Oh," and then she recognized me. I did that to 4 people yesterday. Totally freaked them out. I wasn't trying to. I was just looking for mounds, you know. This is just a little bit south of the mill pond. So the mill pond is right about here, and then it comes down, and then it kind of goes like this, and then Sandy Beach is kind of down here. So that's a general area. And this is the maps that Charles E. Brown produced. He came back in 1907, August 19th of 1907, actually before some Scavlar's maps. And he just notes, Charles Brown had really nice detailed maps that he just kind of field sketched like this gave dimensions, and he noted if mounds had been pitted into by looters and things like that. And I was able to figure out that this map that was referring to this area right here, if you read the descriptions in the reports and things, that's just blowing up. 120 foot long linear mound. Sheep, cedar, what does that say? Rock Lake, ravine. Here's the other bottom portion of that mound site in a larger map. You can see the Panther Mound, the linear mounds down here again, and then that's referring to this Panther. Sometimes when you look at maps in a book, especially even Increased Lapham's maps, there'll be a north arrow on these maps generally, but they're not really aligned. Like when we started to do this celestial alignment business and we started looking at this really carefully, we actually had to get a computer program where we re-entered these maps due to true north, and it would totally shift these maps around on how they actually are in the landscape. When you're looking at maps in a book, you might be looking at this, map like this, but north might be like that way. You know what I mean? Yep. So we had to kind of realign them to true north. And
did they just build right over the top of all these? They're not
yeah.
Anymore. My
yeah.
house is on that.
Yeah, most of them, 90% of them are destroyed, plowed right over, houses built right over them. Oftentimes they would take the soil away for fill for roads in the area, or they were looted and totally just looted for nothing. One thing I should also tell you is that effigy mounds don't contain any burial goods of any kind, typically. Now, early woodland conical mounds typically will have burial goods like arrowheads and pottery and things like that, but effigy mound builders didn't place any goods in their mounds as burial offerings. So digging them, you're not going to find anything, and people found that out pretty quickly. But they still dug them anyway, which was really unfortunate, but that was what they did. Here's that lynx that he talks about, the bear in that same group. That's the actual field sketch map from 1912. And then even right here, there's a Dr. Stephen Peet, who was also a mound researcher back in that day. And he says in some of his notes that many skeletons were taken from mounds at Rock Lake and forwarded to the U.S. Army Medical Museum. They used to dig mounds looking for skeletal examples and use them for research in medical places and things.
Are any of these mounds preserved?
What's that?
Are any of them preserved?
Some of them. I'll show you. That's and this mound was noted as being 60 foot long, 30 feet wide, and 4 feet high. A pretty good sized bear mound, which is typical. Here's a panther mound in that group that they field sketched, 6 feet high. That's a foot taller than me. I'm a hobbit. And imagine that mound being mounded up this high and 20 feet long. That's a big mound. The best examples of really large mounds like that are in Lizard Mound County Park or at Effigy Mounds National Monument. Some of those places have pretty good sized mounds like that. There's an example of a panther mound on the ground here at Lizard Mound. See the head, foreleg, tail going off in the distance. Very similar to that mound in down by the shore there. I'll skip all that. It just talks about sandy beach. Had 1 panther, 4 linear, 11 conicals. First noted in 1910. Robert Ferry Street over there in that area, the neck of the woods over there. Ferry was one of these guys who was digging some of these mounds, and it says here in 23 that he noted that the course of grading down the gravel hill upon which the mounds, 3 of the Indian burials were disinterred. So people have wrote about this. This Jay Cox guy. Jay Cox was a guy who actually surface collected a lot of artifacts off of Aztalan over here, and some of his artifacts are in the church museum right here. So if you're looking at some of the Mississippian artifacts in here, those are coming from partly from Jay Cox. Sandy Beach, a group of 16 mounds, was located on the former Knickerbocker Ice Company property. Now the Sandy Beach Resort, a short distance west of Lake Mills Railroad Depot. Most of the mounds were on the crest of the hill, overlooking the lake shore, and were a short distance north of the CNNW R&R right-of-way with the railroad there. And they are on a grassy top of rounded extremity. So when you're down there, if you go down to the beach area there, and you go through the gate, and there's the bathroom right there, if you go back to the east and upslope where those homes are up on top, that's where those mounds are located. A large conical burial mound site up there. And that's what it looked like. So here's where the beach is right now, where the Knickerbocker Ice House used to be. And I have a photo of that I'll show you. Then if you go back upslope, and this is the road that goes towards the depot this way, these mounds are up on that little grassy, well, what they described as a grassy knoll at that time. What's that?
Are they still there?
No. No. House is right on top of them. That's just another map showing the distribution. This is what we were referred to as a tapering linear that tapers. Sometimes they're just cigar shaped, sometimes they taper.
The combinations of those create mega effigies or outlining a bigger.
Let me get back to that. I have an answer for you. This is what that mound site would have looked like. See, I took Rosebro's map and turned it upright because this would have been where the road is going towards the depot. The beach would have been down here. Then you have that trailer park that's in those woods that's right along that stretch there. That's where those mounds were, up in that area. Here's the Knickerbocker Ice House right on the beach. It was a massive complex, that place. Big, big ice house place. That's on the Knickerbocker, the mounds are right behind this place. This is hard to see, but this is a mound that some people believe that this is a mound down by the bathrooms, down by the beach down there. And it very well possibly could be. And I know that's a source of contention for some people that want to develop this area. So then Charles E. Brown writes, some distance east of these mounds on the road, on the north side of the road from Lake Mills Railroad Station and Sandy Beach Road, there is a solitary effigy of a panther mound. So we had the panther mound on Main Street, but then there's also this other solitary panther mound that was right on that road between the depot and the Sandy Beach. And believe me, I've walked that entire stretch and looked behind every house, and I cannot find any remnant of that mound anymore, unfortunately. It would have been something if we could have preserved that. Body measures 24 at its longest, tapering tail 60 feet in length, 10 feet. And this is the map of it, that quick little sketch of it. So also a letter to Charles E. Brown from a tailor in Brown's archival boxes describes a series of mounds on Sandy Beach. His grandfather said that he was always told that mounds were the burial sites of a great chieftain. This mound was one. Some of these mounds were excavated by local people in the past summers, yielding bodies of 2 male adults, 1 female, and a child. These bodies were buried head toward the center as spokes in a wheel in a conical mound. Skull of the larger male was not dissimilar to those found at Aztalan Cemetery. That doesn't mean anything. Now here's the site that's just a little bit south of, this is the mound site that's in the trailer park off of A. So if you go right across the train tracks, which are kind of wooded right there, and you're into the trailer park right there, the mounds begin right there. And this mound remains, this one, and these two right here. And some of these were dug into by this Hubert Jaycox guy, and he just says that they found bones in it. Some of the conicals. One of the mounds was 10 or 12 feet in diameter, 4 or 5 feet high. This mound was constructed of surface soil mixed with quantities of ash and clamshell valves. At its base was an oval case and an envelope made of soil with ashes that contained pieces of charred wood. This later may have been the butt end of a pole similar to those erected on. So you know the conical mounds that are right over here at Aztalan, right on the road here, big conical mounds, right? Well, when those were excavated by Samuel Barrett back in 1919, 1920, those are not burial mounds over here like the Princess over here. Those mounds contained large cedar posts in the middle of them. That when Barrett excavated down, he actually found the bases of the posts still in the mounds. So they were using those for some type of ceremonial purpose, or possibly, you know, a marker of some kind, maybe green corn ceremony pole, something like that. So along the lakefront there, they also constructed apparently some ceremonial type mounds that had posts in them for whatever reason. This is actually a photograph of Brown and Ferry and Lyon and Miller, a couple of guys excavating a mound. It's a really bad photo, but they're basically just digging in the middle of a conical mound and excavating it. This is a field sketch notebook sketch from Charles Brown from 1919, and you see the conical mound in the woods there. Everson conical mounds looking north.
Is that in Lake Mills?
What's that? Yes. Yes. So you have Everson Mound Site on Rock Lake, 1919. This is what you will see when you drive through the trailer park over there. And this Jaycox guy found a pole in this mound. That mound is still there. It's very big. It's a big mound. I'm going to show you some photos. A lot of these mounds in this grouping seem to have a south by southwest angle. And that's very typical of effigy mound sites because of celestial alignment type things, which is a whole nother lecture. But it kind of harkens to the theory of this path of souls alignment on the landscape type of thing.
No birds? No birds.
No birds. There's one bird in the entire Rock Lake region, which is really interesting. This is also the area of a known Indian village in that golf course field over there. You know where you can hit balls over there by the trailer park? There were conical burial mounds in that field at one time, and an Indian village site at one time, right there, supposedly.
Those mounds over here, do they all have posts in them?
I can't. I'm totally deaf. You got to really.
All of the mounds over here in Aztalan, do they all have posts in them?
No,
Just the one?
no. That's. I can talk to you about that after. That's a whole nother lecture. But they don't. No. These are the couple of the conical mounds that were in that group that are a little bit farther to the south. 35-foot diameter mound, 22 feet wide. A large, pretty good sized conicals. Now this is just the excavation profile of that large 30-foot diameter oval shaped mound. Now, here's the thing I didn't mention before. When we talked about mound construction in the early woodland period, 500 BC, when they first start building conical mounds, right? So they do this for about 1,000 years until the effigy mound builders come along. And what the effigy mound builders do is that they go to sites that are even ancient to them by 1,000 years and start building effigies in and amongst conical mounds that are already there. So what they're doing is that there's this recognition of sacred space, right? They're going back to sites that they're recognizing as sacred space and building mounds in and amongst conical mounds. So oftentimes when you have these really large conical mounds intermixed with the effigies, most of the time those conical mounds are much older than the effigy mounds that are there. And when they excavated this mound, I can tell you with a great deal of certainty that this is an early woodland mound. And I know this because I've studied early woodland mound construction in great detail on a couple of different projects. And typically they're really large mounds like this, and they typically contain bundle burials and a lot of cremation type burials with the use of red ochre. You guys know what red ochre is? Red ochre is iron hematite that is ground down into a red powder, and then it's mixed with bear grease, and it makes a paint. So when you see those caves in France like Lascaux and places like that, when they're using the different colors of red and things on those cave paintings, that's red ochre. And one of the stories I like to tell, and I'm not trying to minimize racism at all by saying this, but I am, but when the early European settlers first landed on the Atlantic coast, most of the Native Americans were completely dyeing themselves with red ochre, bright red ochre paint. So this concept of redskins, that's where it really comes from. It's not, I mean, today it's like a racist term like a football team and stuff like that, but that idea of redskins came from the fact that a lot of Native Americans used to paint themselves red with red ochre. And then if you're landing on the shore and you see a couple of dudes standing there and they're bright red naked, I mean, that's going to make an impression on you, right? And that's what they were saying. And I have no doubt that Native Americans in this time period were doing this here as well. So they used to, and what they would do is they'd take this powder of red ochre, and they would, in some cases, put 5 or 6 inch layers, thick layers of ochre on top of these burials inside these conical mounds. Is something to do with ritualism. Now, this idea of red ochre is brought all the way from the Paleolithic, 40, 50,000 years ago from the Ice Age, with the Native Americans to North America, and is continually used as a ritual concept in their belief system. And the other thing they said that they had in this mound was crushed rock and sand-tempered pottery shards. I know that, being an archaeologist, that the only type of crushed or pottery that has crushed rock and sand tempering is early woodland pottery. Mississippian pottery that you see at Aztalan here is tempered with clamshells, very thin-walled and much stronger than this early woodland stuff. It's an entirely different type of artifact. So this is just a side plain profile of that, and it talks about the location of hard-packed base clay. Somebody had dug into this mound looking for relics, and they noted a previous looting hole in the center. I'm almost done, guys. Everson Conical Mound this is another conical mound that was erected in that. And this one was only 14 feet wide in diameter and only about 10 inches high in the middle. So a very low-lying conical mound, which is not typical, but it might have been disturbed. This is more than likely, they talk about these pockets of red ochre in here, mixed with ash, which is probably cremation type burials. That's a close-up of the subsurface ritualism with red ochre deposits with possible cremation burials. For some reason, he changed it from red ochre to paint. I don't know why he did that, but. Now, these are the mounds that still remain in the trailer park over there, the ones that the arrows point to. And when you go through there, if you go to the far back north side of the trailer park, right along the edge of the tracks, right beyond this White House here, right along here is this linear mound right here, right in this guy's front yard here. And it was actually cut in half by the railroad track development years ago. But a portion of it is to the south of it. This is hard to see, but when you come up the street this way to the south, there's another linear mound in this guy's front yard right here, a tapering linear. It's there. If you drive over there today, you'll see it. This is another photograph of that same mountain. You can see a little bit better going right through here. This is the effigy. Now this looks like a linear, right? But it has these two appendages here that make it look like an effigy of some type. I'm not really sure what they're trying to depict there. But that's there. And there's the back part of it from about here back is underneath this guy's house. And you can't see any of this picture, but you can see this front appendage right here if you go over there. I stopped and I actually talked to the guy that owned that house, and he had absolutely no idea that that house is on top of that mound. He didn't. This is one of the low-lying conical mounds right here, right next to that so that one effigy I just showed you is kind of over here, and then this conical is right there. That's still there. And this is that real big, it's hard to see, but it's a big conical mound right here with a big tree, big 300-plus-year-old tree right on top of it. And then if you look beyond it up here, behind this guy's house, closer to the water, you can see another mound right back up in there. It's a linear embankment. It's hard to see in the photo here, but it's there. I would encourage you to everybody to drive over there today. They'll love it. They'll have like a procession of people going through there.
And ask everybody questions.
Yeah.
Are those protected?
Huh?
Are those protected now? Or
What?
Are they protected?
I really can't hear it. Let me get to that. Hold on. I'm almost done. I want to finish this up, then we can answer questions quick. 'Cause I know other people want to do other stuff. So here's the last mound site, Crossing Mounds. This is the only one that's on the western side of the lake. This one is over on the southwest shore, section 15. Again, conical and linears. This mound site is probably an old mound site. There's the complete map of it. Now, I took a picture there yesterday of that area where it would have been, but you can't see it. There's one more I got to talk about, Eagle Island. Who's familiar with Bean Island? Bean Lake or Bean Island? This guy's been out there. Had to walk up this deep in marsh to get out there. On the island out there are linear embankments that have been interpreted in different ways. And on that island, it's now they call it Eagle Island, was mapped in 1912 by Charles E. Brown. Shallow trenches in an irregular oval shape. So you see all these big trenches. This is indicative of like Hopewell type stuff, but it's not. It's not Hopewell, but it's like Hopewell. But there also noted all these 24 pits, circular pits in the ground. And what I think is going on there was that this site is really hard to get to. You have to really bushwhack to get to it, go across marsh, and it's really better to go out there in the wintertime when the ice freezes and stuff. But this was a site that was hidden, that was probably used as not only a campsite, but those pits in there are probably rice threshing pits. Because especially on that southwest corner of the lake, and as you go up the lake to the north on the southwest side, you can see there's a lot of vegetation over there. And at one time, that had to have been massive wild rice beds in that area. And so they were taking wild rice, threshing it in pits here more than likely. But that's just an interpretation. Here's Charles Brown's map from 1926. You can see all these pits in the middle here, circular embankments. Some archaeologists, or I should say some researchers, have interpreted this to be a gigantic serpent mound. Now, I don't think that's what's going on here. That's my opinion. And I'll show you a map by Dr. James Shears, who is part of the Ancient Earthwork Society, that mapped this site very differently than the previous researchers. And that's part of the problem with studying a lot of these mound sites, because you might have 5 or 6 people that looked at a mound site and nobody maps it exactly the same. So he interpreted this to be as some type of a giant serpent with a head right here, and then a solstice alignment that went, winter solstice alignment that went through the tail here. Maybe. You can see this just shows you the major differences in mapping. So, some differences. And you know, if you go out there at different times of the year, whether there's leaf duff on the ground or whatever, it's hard to see. This is a photograph. There's Bob Birmingham standing right here. This is one of the embankments right through here he's standing on in the wintertime. Pictured by Dan Sawyer, a member of the Friends group. Him and Bob went out there a few years ago. Here's one of the linear embankments here. The trench on either side with the snow. You know, and it's, I was going to show you guys a lot of photographs of mounds today, but because of time constraints, I'm not going to do that today. But when they were out there, they actually found a projectile point laying in the ground out there. which is an archaic projectile point, which is really interesting. That's a really old projectile point. We're talking 8500 BC. So now this is a mound. This is a conical mound. You can kind of see that is on the northeast side, way above the mill dam in the woods, down from Culver's. Possible mound. This is a conical mound in the city park on the north side of the lake there. And then another, this mound is right by your house. I'll tell you about that. This is a conical mound for sure. I'm almost 100% positive this is a mound that was not mapped in any of these other mappings of stuff. So there are outlier mounds that were not mapped. So just to surmise, lots of mounds, eastern side of the lake, through the lower southeastern side, predominantly lower world dominated mounds, water spirits, linear panthers, snakes, all these types of things. Most of them don't exist anymore except outside of the trailer park. And more than likely in this area because of the high yield of resources. Now, these are some of the organizations that I'm involved with that you can find on Facebook. If you're interested in mounds or archaeology or general topic matters, Ancient Earthwork Society of Wisconsin, Wisconsin Archaeological Society, Friends of Aztalan, my organization, the Effigy Mounds Initiative. Chris Veit and I run the Gathering Waters Archaeology LLC, which is our own archaeology firm. So you can find information on Facebook about all these things. And that's it. Thank you.